such a privilege to be here, and I want to thank Alan and JC and the other members of the ARNHE exec for putting together such an amazing program, and to Prof. Mkhize for the very inspiring keynote that really set the tone for discussions that will be taken forward in the next panel, I'm quite sure of. So I'd like to ask the panelists to please come forward, and I'd like to welcome them to the event, and it's really lovely to have you here. So a big welcome to Prof. Christy van der Westhuizen, Dr. William Mpofu. Where's Dr. William Mpofu, Nolikolo Mflapo, and we are missing Wiklali Pedro Mzileni. Michali, would you like to come up? Yeah. We seem to have lost a lot of people outside, so hopefully they will filter through. And we're going to ask our panelists to talk. Yeah, I'm going to disappear in a second. Right. We're going to ask our panelists to speak for a maximum of 15 minutes. We'll start notifying you at 10, because I think, as we've seen in the last session, it's been amazing, the dialogue and the debate. And I think, as our keynote and others have already mentioned, it is the debate that we're hoping to inspire and to invigorate in the space and in the larger spaces of our universities. So we're going to kick off with Prof. Christy van der Westhuizen, who's an author, a political analyst, a former journalist, and she's currently Associate Professor at the University of Pretoria. She's a long engagement in transformation processes in South African universities. She holds associateships in a range of institutes, like some of the ones that are represented here, and organizations. She's also published widely, including 3 books that also relate to the topics that she speaks to, most recent being Sitting Pretty, White Afrikaans Women in Post-Apartheid South Africa, which will come out in 2017, and Working Democracy, Perspectives on South Africa's Parliament at 20 Years. Christy, thanks for being with us, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, Tammy. Am I audible? Oh, great. Thanks a lot, and I want to thank ARNHE for inviting me to be in this. It's great to be in this space. I really enjoyed our keynote this morning, Professor Mkhize, and the very interesting conversation that followed. So I'm looking forward to continuing that in our session. I've been having an ongoing debate with my students, actually, in my master's class at the University of Pretoria, about the idea of a politics of possibility, which is a phrase that Eka Peterson and Frank Meintjes use in their book Voices of the Transition. It came out about 10, 14 years ago. And it speaks of, on the one hand, of course, South Africa's daunting and uncertain future in relation to poverty, joblessness, one could add socioeconomic inequality, and so forth. But they say that in the face of that, we should be crafting a politics of possibility, which is in away from a kind of development mindset of probability that focuses on constraints and teleology, to one of possibility, which is about a more challenging and appropriate politics for the present. On the one hand, such a politics won't be naive in terms of the difficulties and complexities of democratizing our country, but it would put a lot of emphasis on reimagining what we have in South Africa for a more inclusive and democratic future. So, in the 1990s, South Africa did seem rich with the idea of a politics of possibility, and I thought I should declare myself at this point in time. As Professor Zinn was also saying this morning, it's good to situate and place oneself. I speak from the subject position in a sense as a 90s kid. Not that I was born in the 90s, but rather that I came of age in the 1990s. And to me, it was, in a sense, a birth, because it did promise an escape from the rabidly racist and heteropatriarchal conditions that I grew up in Boksburg on the east rand of Johannesburg. Of course, we know that since then despondency, disillusionment, derision and so forth have set in since the heady days of the 1990s. The Rainbow Nation has been slayed. It's not only naive, but essentializing, in that it keeps us in our assigned covered lanes. Reconciliation has imploded as a political project. That word, the R word, did come up already today. Pressures are emerging also that the Constitution should go the same way as the idea of reconciliation. That the very idea of constitutional democracy was an error. And we see in a kind of a de-historicization, which I think also links to what we were talking about this morning, a kind of a de-historicizing move, we see an equivalence being created between constitutionalism and what's called neo-apartheid. So in my master's class, we were debating whether politics of possibility is even well possible today. So this is a debate because of the fatigue that has set in, the disheartened state that we have entered, the sense of hopelessness in terms of where we are now. We have lost sense of the possible, never mind the politics of it. And I must hasten that this state is not unique to us, it sweeps the globe. It gave us Trumpism and Brexit. It's been fortified by Trumpism and Brexit, and by figures like Putin, Erdogan, Shinzo Abe and James Ader, to name a few of the populist and one could say fascist, semi-fascist kinds of leaders that have arisen across the globe. Of course, in South Africa we've got the zuptocracy that's bringing us down in more ways than one. So I wanted to start with the politics of possibility, or mentioning this particular phrase and idea, because I wonder if decolonization, as we have seen it in practice at our universities, the activism of it, whether this exemplifies the politics of possibility. A politics that emerges from being a transitional state with all the uncertainties that might mean, but also all of the potentialities. The formulation of decolonization, and I think here I do concur with Professor Mkhize, the formulation of decolonization, as we've seen it on our campuses, might have diagnosed the ills of white bourgeois heteropatriarchy, but the question comes up time and again to refer to the South African Sociological Association's conference theme this year. We know what must fall, but what must rise. So let me take a step back and talk briefly about what decolonization in its myriad understandings and theorizations has brought us over the years. And this is not in any way exhaustive, but this is just a few thoughts, given that we've got very limited time. So the first are, of course, the first of these is, of course, a diagnosis, or actually, in the plural, diagnoses of the problem that make it clear that the transformation project that we embarked upon 20 plus years ago has faltered. And this links with the second contribution of decolonization, namely that it brings to the fore a rich set of theorizations that can be drawn and built on, and in fact comes with a clarion call for us to excavate the black and women thinkers and the others of the West that have been marginalized or buried by Western cultural hegemonization. This involves, or purports to involve at least, the refreshment of our curricula and of the university as a space for critical thinking and intellectual engagement that addresses where we are as opposed to where the global north think we should be. So, and the third, and what is particularly useful about the decolonization impetus in this moment, is its sense of action and related activism. In its widest interpretation, decolonization involves an active dismantling of the vestiges of colonialism, something that transformation seems to have lost its grip on. So this links well with anti-racism as one plank of transformation, which works, or used to work at least, as a political project with the implying an activist agenda. Another particularly powerful contribution of the decolonization impetus is that as a term it brings to the fore South Africa's colonial legacies and its condition as a post-colonial state. This is perhaps something that in transformation has sort of slipped from the view at times, perhaps due to South African exceptionalism, and perhaps because of the use of the term apartheid, which might obscure the idea of apartheid being first and foremost a form of colonialism. This list is not exhaustive, as I said, but I want to use my time to ask more critical questions about decolonization in relation to transformation. Now, a couple of years ago, Professor Norman Duncan, who's also here today from the University of Pretoria, and I launched a transformation talk series at the University of Pretoria, in which we brought colleagues from other universities to UP to critically think through transformation from all angles. I did, of course, as we do, put the invitation onto Facebook, and shortly thereafter I was reprimanded, and the following answer was demanded from me in a high and mighty style that leftists use to try and discipline one another. And the question was, namely, what do I mean by transformation, and how do I dare use the term? It became clear then that there was a new sheriff in town, and I'd actually stepped out of line. So, in the spirit of decolonization's questioning approach to previously received wisdoms, I want to question whether those agitating for the rapid fall of transformation and its replacement with decolonization have actually conducted a proper investigation into transformation, number one, and number two, why transformation as a political project has faltered and even failed, whether this has actually been investigated properly. And this I do linking with Achille Mbembe's suggestion that the wholesale embrace of ideas that land on our shores without a critical reworking of such ideas in relation to our own realities and lived experiences is folly, is irrespective of whether those ideas came from the global north or the global south. We have to ask ourselves as critical thinkers who want to eradicate the legacies and continuities of colonialism and apartheid from South Africa, what does decolonization mean in South Africa in relation to transformation? This question of transformation links with anti-racism as the transformation project that many also in this room has been involved with was about anti-racism. As I've mentioned before, anti-racism is or was a central plank of transformation. If we can better understand what has happened with transformation, we can also be alert to the trappings in which decolonization as a project might land, also in relation to race and anti-racism. So firstly, I would like to caution against discarding the very necessary and important theorizations and praxis that were generated in the pursuit of transformation over the past 20 plus years. And here I'm linking also with what Professor Zinn was saying earlier today. The transformation that was about anti-racism was not some meek project to mollycoddle settlers, as some decolonization proponents might suggest. And to get this across, there's one definition of transformation that I use quite frequently from Salim Badat, where he speaks of transformation as having the aim of the dissolution of existing social relations and institutions, policies and practices, and creating radically new social arrangements. Of course, the process of dissolution and creation may be uneven and vary in place, and there may not be uniform rupture or total displacement of old structures, institutions, and practices. In a nutshell, while transformation signifies fundamental change, not all change is transformation. And this is an ongoing process, as Professor Zinn was also talking about this morning. Transformation in this sense is a radical project in that it was meant to go to the root, for example, to attack the root of racism. Therefore, it seems to me more useful to speak of multiple projects of transformation. If I think of the incisive critiques, analyses, and research produced by many, also by many people in this room, I am loath to simply lump all that is associated with transformation into one box and throw it out the window. If we accept that there are multiple projects of transformations, then the first of those multiple projects of transformation would be how transformation was translated into policy and laws. Last night somebody at the book launch remarked that the problem with transformation was that it was driven through the state. But we need to remember that in those heady days of the 1990s, those that associated themselves with the values and aims of the liberation movements all for the first time actually accessed the state with the idea of transforming it and using it as the primary tool of transformation. All the focus was on the state, and many activists were absorbed into the state, and much been written actually about the impoverishment of civil society in the process. It would seem that it's time to review the primacy of the state. I would suggest it might be the moment to review that primacy, as the attempted institutionalization of transformation brought us only so far and not far enough, also in terms of universities. So this is a cautionary note for decolonization as a project. To what extent should it be institutionalized? This is closely linked to the question of neoliberalization, which is something that I hardly, if ever, hear about from decolonization activists at universities. We are in an age, to quote one of my favorite Oscar Wilde sayings, of cynicism, that is where people know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Neoliberalization of the universities means that the counting of everything has taken the place of substantive equality and justice. Neoliberalization in relation to the university is about managerialization and corporatization. I propose that is where the official versions of transformation got stuck, whether from universities or from government or from universities themselves. Which, and in any case, these processes are closely interlinked, whether from government or universities, because universities are also acting in terms of legislation as drafted by government. So it is precisely the adoption and application of neoliberal precepts as some form of transformation, which I call a tick box transformation, that place us in this position. We need to critically reckon with this dominant form of transformation and the reasons for its rise. As leftists, it's easy to fall for neoliberalism, I think, because its emphasis on technocratic modus operandi are not far removed from the centrality that socialism gives to bureaucratic processes in addressing and redressing the ills of society. It is as if leftists capitulated to the post-history, post-ideology idea of neoliberalism, in which process and procedure replace politics. So tick box transformation replaces anti-racism and anti-sexism with getting the demographics right, which I'm not saying that getting the demographics right is not a primary first step, but it is a first step, it's not the only step. Getting the demographics right, and then also having this fuzzy, warm, so-called diversity, which is really about also de-historicizing and decontextualizing. If you look into it, neoliberal diversity allows its others only in on very circumscribed terms, and that's actually what's happened in our universities. You can bring black people in, but whiteness will continue to permeate the institution. It comes prominently to the fore in the discourse that positions substantive transformation in opposition to internationalization, which is something that also came up last night, the idea of internationalization. So there's a discourse that, in a sense, pits substantive transformation against internationalization. And the argument is quite crude, but it's basically that substantive inclusion of black people and women can only bring standards down, and that's bad for rankings, so we have to choose. Here I am referring to neoliberalism's inclusion-exclusion dynamics, which speaks to race, but also to gender and sexuality. It's white picket fence stuff. Black people that abide by a particular colour blindness and bourgeoisness, gay people that abide by a particular heteronormativity, and I'm using gay in a very purposeful way here, women that abide by the blue-pink divide. And these subjects are only allowed in if they are thoroughly depoliticized. All others are ejected. These are also, of course, times in which essentialism as discourse is on the rebound, also courtesy of neoliberalism. Neoliberal diversity is all about essences, core blackness, whiteness, womanhood, manhood, gayness. What does this mean in relation to those prominent strands of decolonization at our universities that also seek to re-essentialize black and white? This links to official transformations, which is now, for me, the failed version of transformation. It's obfuscation of others outside of race, with elevation of race as sole focus for radical redress, as though any social marker operates in pure isolation. What does it mean for decolonization positions that very much focus in on race to the detriment of other categories? What does it mean for gender non-conforming students, women and queers in the Fees Must Fall movement at WITS and UCT? Is anti-racism a viable project on its own? In conclusion, I want to ask what might be a provocative question. Mindful of Mbembe's idea of theoretical and political projects that borrow what is relevant from elsewhere, but that are locally grounded and speak to local realities, was transformation not South Africa's first attempt at the decolonization project? The original idea of transformation, as we started to drive it in the 1990s. A decolonization project then that was hobbled or even corrupted by neoliberalization or corporatization of universities. and that is currently again being set back by reactionary forces that have regrouped and have returned to see some of our higher education institutions that they regard as rightfully theirs, to also refer back to a comment that was made last night. That if this is so, the challenge is to bring back politics to transformation, an all-encompassing politics of anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-homophobia that seeks social and economic justice. What we have seen in the decolonization rhetoric at our campuses is exactly this. And this is the strength of the decolonization impetus, that it brings politics back in to the center. But I've also already been to at least one talk where the decolonization was placed in a PowerPoint grid, broken down in discrete steps with deliverables and targets, all ready to be included as a KPI in the performance management. So how about taking transformation back from neoliberalism, decolonizing it, so to speak, and reasserting and reactivating its radical dimensions? Thanks.
Thanks. We're just holding up the end, please sign. Welcome to Dr. William Mpofu, who's a researcher at the Wits Center for Diversity Studies, known as WICIDS. His research interest is in the philosophy of liberation, specifically areas of decoloniality, using frameworks of critical diversity literacy and critical humanism. William is also a member of ARNHE, which is Africa Decolonized Decolonial Research Network. It's wonderful to have you, and over to you.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. All right. Right, just let me know of my performance in terms of time as I go. Right, I speak as a decolonial thinker, and as I've been introduced, I'm at the Wits Center for Diversity Studies, and I'm interested in the issues of the human as it happens in the university. My point of departure will be, it is a myth that decoloniality has been imported from Latin America. And that myth is confabulated by people who are lazy to read on decoloniality. One of the first decolonial encounters in the African Academy was in 1962, when African writers met at the University of Makerere. When people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Achebe, and others met. And that is where Bolegaja criticism of African literature was born, where pioneers of decoloniality like Chinua Achebe from Nigeria went on to publish that book about the decolonization of African literature. That is in the 1960s, well before Ngugi and well before Mamdani and other people. So to say decoloniality marginalizes the African archive is to make an incorrect observation and persuasively to make an incorrect argument. Right, what I'm going to speak on, we need, before we delve into issues of transformation, decolonization, Africanization, and so forth, we need to understand this organism called the university. In Africa, which is part of the global south, there were universities before the colonial encounters. We can talk about Timbuktu, Alexandria, Al-Azhar, and Sankore. But with colonial conquest, the university in the world became westernized, which means with increasing Western political and economic power, the model of the university that we experience now is a Western university in the world. One of the contributions of decoloniality is in understanding how the world system works. Because in trying to decolonize the westernized university that we are in here, we are trying to provide local solutions for global problems. If we miss that point, then we would have missed a very fundamental point, because a university, as it is right now, is a facility of the world system. I want to speak about the turns that this organism has made in time. And the first turn has been the Western turn, where the university became white, became predominantly male, became Eurocentric, became Christian, And in the process, human diversity and epistemic diversity suffered. So if we are to decolonize this organism, we need to seek ways of restoring human and epistemic diversity. We can do that by speaking Xhosa, but it won't be enough. And we can end up sinking down into Xhosa as a fundamentalism when the project is liberation. After the Western turn, the university took a colonial turn. When missionaries, merchants, and empire builders came into Africa and the global south, they came with an agenda to produce colonial subjects, to shape us into docile, disciplined subjects of empire. And the university was complicit in that project. That's how universities were used to produce workers, not thinkers, to produce laborers, not philosophers. That was the colonial project of the university, which is going on as I speak. If we don't go to the archaeology of that, then we won't understand what we are dealing with in the university. After the colonial turn, the university took a nationalist turn, which is the turn that Walter Rodney, Mandela, and other African thinkers were fighting. When African founding fathers of decolonization wanted to change universities into instruments of the Marxist, nationalist decolonization project. That's why most African intellectuals had to go to exile. Because people like Kwame Nkrumah, as radical as he was, wanted to turn the University of Ghana into an arm of his government. And the intellectuals resisted that as colonial and insisted on their academic and intellectual freedom. After the nationalist turn, which is still going on at some levels, there was the corporate turn, which came on the back of the Washington Consensus, the SAPs that came to the global south, where the university was turned into a site of the market forces. Knowledge making itself became captive to the tyranny of the markets. What Mandela says that scholars became scholars in the marketplace. Knowledge itself lost its truth value and gained market value. Whereby if you project humanities, critical studies that seek to center the human, you are reminded that what money are we going to make with this discipline? Which is problematic. All these are trends that are taking place concurrently, but actually defining what the university is as we experience it. And there was a tragic academic turn in the university, where the university became academic and less intellectual. Because an academic and an intellectual are not the same thing. All intellectuals might be academics, but not all academics are intellectuals. So the university took a tragic academic turn where ideologies were pegged as knowledge, where opinions were turned into fundamental truths, and where fundamentalism became citizen at the university, where if someone believes an idea, then therefore that idea is it and nothing else. Yeah. So if you look at all these turns, they all have their underside. Like the nationalist turn, as revolutionary and progressive as it sounds, is the turn that produced xenophobia, nativism, racism, autochthon, and other isms that Fanon talks about in the pitfalls of national consciousness, where all these institutions were turned into ethno-provincial institutions, where because I'm Xhosa, I'm the one who's supposed to be the chairperson of the department, regardless of what I'm here to offer. And this turn also led, part of the academic turn was the real unpopularity of intellectual industry, where I can analyze a whole archive without even reading it. Just what I feel about it, that's what is true about it, which makes the tragic turns that this place has taken. And in all these turns, there has been a magnification of hate, where hate has been catapulted into an epistemology. Everyone enters into the university looking for somebody and something to hate. and where misreading has been elevated into a methodology. Without reading your paper, I will just misread it and then judge based on what I've misread about it. And in the process, we've been getting misdirections. Where intentional ignorance, that is deliberately not knowing something, has become a methodological approach. And the refusal to listen to the other, where my point is a point and no other point is supposed to exist. So the university, as we experience it, is a creature of the modern colonial world system. If we are to decolonize it, transform it, Africanize it, we need to do that in awareness of this reality. And I want to talk about the position and location of the student in the life of this organism called the Westernized University. There is a temptation amongst the professors especially to look at students as people who are a problem, not people who have a problem. And we need to carefully go back to Freire, who's from Brazil and is an important liberation thinker. We cannot essentialize colonial borders, psychic cartographies, without being colonial ourselves. To say that someone like Freire, because they were born geographically in Brazil, therefore they have to come behind the thinkers in my neighborhood, even if their truths are applicable to our condition of domination, is to sink down to area studies and is to become a fundamentalist in essence. And it is to reproduce coloniality in our black bodies and our black systems, which is what decoloniality is fundamentally against. That paper that I managed to recommend in a hurry, it starts with a sentence that says decoloniality needs to avoid repeating fundamentalisms, be they Eurocentric fundamentalism or third world fundamentalisms. And there's another thinker called Boaventura Santos, a white Portuguese man who has produced an important text titled Epistemologies of the South. In that book, Santos amplifies, illuminates, and magnifies some of the issues that Professor raised in the morning. Without being colonial and essential, we cannot throw Santos out of the conversation by virtue of his skin and his geographic birth. In doing that, we will be practicing decolonial politics using colonial logic, left-wing activism using right-wing approaches. And it's very easy to do that. That's why in the university, you have female intellectuals, or academics in fact, reproducing patriarchy. You have black bodies reproducing white racism. You have, because we use the logics of the dominations that present themselves upon us. And this can be unconscious, but it cannot be forgivable. Can I stop here?
Fantastic. We had a few minutes to spare. Thanks very much, Dr. Paul. Our next speaker is Norukolo Mtlapo. Welcome, Norukolo. She's director of the Institutional Culture. Sounds quite intriguing, at Rhodes University. She has an M.Phil in linguistics and MSc in social anthropology, and she's currently pursuing her PhD in social psychology at the University of Cape Town. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Microphone. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you. When I asked JC what it is that we're supposed to talk about, he said anything. And because there's so much that can be said in this space, I was quite lost for a while. And it is only yesterday that I decided to just ground whatever I have to say in my experiences. That is because I'm assuming that I've been invited to speak on this theme of anti-racism in an era of decolonization, upping the game, from a practitioner's point of view, from a person who's working in the Office of Transformation in the higher education sector. I will root my contribution in stories of practice. And I will build my contribution around 4 stories. I'll tell the stories first and then refer to them in my suggestions of how the anti-racism network in higher education can be more responsive to the developments in the higher education sector ushered in by the 2015-16 students' protests. Of course, my suggestions will not be comprehensive and indeed exhaustive, and they will not encompass all the challenges that the sector is faced with. I'll just speak to 4 observations, factors, themes that are at the top of my mind at this moment. Okay, the first story. Last year I was invited to speak on rape, consent, and general transformation issues at one of the female halls of residences at Rhodes University. When I arrived after huffing and puffing up the hill, I found a room packed with mainly undergraduate students, some with berets and scarves on their heads and others with heads laid bare. It was really going to be an interesting conversation. At the end of 2 hours of engagement, one of the students asked, "So what now? What will happen now that we have spoken?" She asked this question pointing at one of the other students who had expressed very strong views against racism and poverty. She said, that student will go back to her life, she'll go back to her family's estate, and I will go back to my life in the township. We have spoken and agreed on a lot of things, but what will change really? I'm so tired of talking. That is story 1. The student pointed at, sorry, the story is not finished. The student pointed at left the room and she was close to tears. When I got outside, she was there waiting for me next to a car and she offered me a lift home. I wanted to decline because I needed to walk off the afternoon, as it were, but I felt obliged to accept her offer. Other than thank you from me at the gate when she dropped me off, we drove in silence. In my notebook, I made a note on the limits of empathy. The second story will again be familiar. It is also an everyday South African story. I was part of a meeting at which the selection strategy for the filling of a senior leadership post was discussed. I cannot tell you what the post was. Suffice to say, it was a very senior level post. The chair of the meeting began the discussion by suggesting that an individual already identified should be screened into the position. Screening is essentially a process through which an individual is promoted into a higher support staff position. The chair then said, the position should ideally be filled by an African woman, but no African woman is qualified for this post. In the course of my expressing my reservations and concern at how the discussion was being framed, I stated that the unions had voiced deep dissatisfaction with the screening process, since the screening process always resulted in a reproduction of the existing staff structure in the institution. The chair turned to me and said, I've spoken to the unions already, and they both agree that screening this individual is the best option for the good of the institution. And both union representatives at the meeting confirmed that they had indeed been spoken to and they had reached an agreement with the chair. The chair knew, even before the position was advertised and responded to, that there was no qualifying African woman out there. The chair was a black African man, and the individual on whose behalf he was canvassing was a white woman. The third story. And the third story is going to be necessarily short. Again, it is a very familiar South African everyday story. Yesterday, my son and I were walking home from my office. An individual who is considered by himself and others in the institution as quite progressive in his role, in his race and gender politics rather, and whose progressive views I'm familiar with because I have worked with him in a gender and sexualities task team, stopped to ask, when is the new, again, executive position person starting? And then he says, we should be very careful. They like bringing in underqualified and inexperienced equity candidates so that they can manipulate them. And I'm included in the we, I realize. I was taken aback by this statement, by the content of the statement, but I was even more taken aback by the fact that the statement had come from this person. The last story is very much a story of our times. Again, in April this year, at a march against state corruption organized by Save South Africa, one member of the academic staff, an HOD, turned to me to ask, but where are the students? Because there were no students at the march. Okay. Now, going back to my first story, I do not have an answer that I would articulate. I did not have an answer that I could articulate at that moment when the student asked about the differences that exist between her reality and the reality of one other student, about the reality of the one other student with whom they had agreed so much about what the solutions to racism on campus was. I still don't have an answer to that question asked, but such conversations always make clear that there is a need for the university to play a bigger role in the achievement of redress and restitution. What can the universities do to further what is, I think, one of the key contributions to change that is very much underplayed, not only in our universities, but in our societies at large? And then what can ARNHE do to further this goal of redress? There are, of course, a number of ideas that can be suggested, but for the purpose of speaking directly to the issues, at least one of the issues brought to the fore by the protests of 2015 and 2016, ARNHE can perhaps advocate a fees model that has as its basis an informing principle, the principle of redress. There are a number of such fees models that have been submitted to the Fees Commission. One such model, submitted by a group of academics who are mainly based in Gauteng, and I know one of the lecturers who contributed to the development of that model is a lecturer here at Mandela University. That model suggests that we need to tax wealth, a taxation of what is called the high net worth individuals who have income of 7 million and above in accumulated wealth, not in terms of salaries and wages, could contribute towards us developing a fees-free education system. A report based on a study by Arthur, I hope I'm pronouncing this word okay, in 26 indicated that 10% of the population own at least 90% of the country's assets. Going to the suggestion that my colleague here made earlier, that perhaps in taking forward transformation, we need to move a step back towards allowing government to lead the transformation project. I would think that advocating for such a basis for funding fees-free education would be one of the ways in which we can actually take responsibility and leadership of the transformation project. Regarding the second story, why South Africans and individuals who live in formations, why South Africans and individuals who live in formations like ours know and write about internalized racism. So there's nothing new. We know internalized racism exists As a black person, I know, for example, if I go to Pick and Pay, I'll be treated in a particular way by both black and white employees that is different from the way that I'll be treated by, in a different way that a white person would normally be treated. And that is not essentializing, that is the black experience. Why we know about internalized racism, there has been a little research into how power is embodied and articulated in higher education institutions. More specifically, there is little research on who rises to the position of leadership in higher education, in the higher education sector. What are their understandings of their purpose? How do their legal identities and lived experiences of subordination and domination impact and intersect with and inform their leadership? How do they see their role in the transformation of the higher education sector? Such research disseminated within the sector and in the country's education system can perhaps further promote what people like Sobukwe and Steve Biko have advocated, developing a consciousness of self through practice. The third story also speaks to the need for research into the psychic life of everyday mundane racism. What is the disjuncture between theoretical knowledge of racism, identity of self, or performance of self, and practice? In our institution, for example, a student of fine art theory who had been taught that blackface has certain connotations, who had been taught its history, etc., reproduced work based on blackface and posted it on the social media. So she knew the history, she knew the practice, but she still reproduced the same practice, reproduced racism in the form of an artwork. So what is this disjuncture? Do we have adequate and useful theories to explain the psychic pleasure derived from the violence of everyday racist statements and racist behavior? Racism is evolving in these institutions. What is practiced now is racism, not what was practiced. Of course, I think this should be obvious 10, 20 years ago. There must be some pleasure derived, and there must be a reason why this system is so creative. And I'm not just talking about the stuff, I'm talking about the everyday practice, the little things that we meet in our everyday black lives. The last story, which was essentially about the question addressed to me, I will also pose a question to the audience here. What role do universities play in the promotion of the separation between racism and corruption? How is it possible for us to speak about corruption here and racism there? How do we in our universities open up public spaces for discussion about the relationships between structures and practices of racism and corruption that are based in this political economy? I guess what I'm trying to argue, therefore, is that if ARNHE is to up its game, then it should develop a program that is directly responsive to the issues raised in the 2015-2016 student protests. And this responsiveness should not only mean research and dialogues, but it should also entail very strong advocacy informed by principled positions against racism. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and for sticking to time. Our last, but certainly not least speaker is Meklani Pedro Mzileni. He's a postgraduate student at the Nelson Mandela University, this university we are located in right now. Also the SRC president for 2017. He completed his Bachelor of Arts Honours Sociology in 2016 at NMU, and is currently studying towards his Masters in Sociology, looking specifically at the political economy of higher education with a particular focus on student accommodation. Welcome, Meklani, and your time is up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairperson. I'm the one who will be managing your pension funds. And it's a pleasure to be amongst educated people, you know. It's a privilege, but at the same time I feel very small. But I'm just going to speak what I know from a student perspective, so that we can have an engagement. Over the past couple of centuries, which are commonly referred to as the era of modernity, there's been a single story of the European colonization of Latin America, Asia and Africa, driven mainly by greed, which developed and nourished capitalism and industrialization. This era has also seen the development of socio-cultural extinction and the birth of what I call sameness. In fact, it is during this era where the division, exploitation and humiliation of people along racial and gender patterns intensified. The violent spread and development of Europe over the world, coupled with the socio-cultural extinction and the birth of sameness, ushered in the hegemony of their orientation on every social structure of life, that being religion, a family structure, the media, community values, the judiciary, and most importantly, knowledge production. I single out knowledge production not only because I'm a student in a university, but I'm also consciously aware that how a people shape their behavior, how they comprehend their history, how they understand their societies, and how they appreciate their culture, all boils down from the informal and formal exchange of knowledge and ideas. The Eurocentric hegemony has shaped knowledge along racial and gender patterns significantly, and South Africa is no different. Apartheid colonialism has left with us with a stubborn legacy of violent social structures that are heavily entrenched on the soul of South Africa in the form of white supremacy, white liberalism, white racism, and black invincibility. In the South African context, racialized knowledge only recognizes the ideas, interests, concerns, practices, and social institutions of the white race. All other people are considered to be invincible and they do not exist. Sarah Ahmed, writing in 2007 on the phenomenology of whiteness, says that whiteness could be described as an ongoing and unfinished story, which orientates bodies in specific directions, affecting how they take up space and what they can do. If to be human is to be white, then to be not white is to inhabit the negative. It is not to be human. The weight of white violence and white supremacy managed to gain hegemony and ultimately gain legitimacy through its infiltration of the South African education system and public literature. The teaching and learning of Eurocentric ideas and the consistent distribution of their knowledge outcomes to the imagination of the public through media has sustained the violent social structure of white liberalism. The hegemonic violence of white liberalism is best demonstrated by the white race arrogantly thinking that the capacity of black people to define and discern their problems for themselves is disabled. Hence, Helen Zille, a white person, has the audacity to publicly describe to black people how apartheid colonialism was of good benefit to black people. This is the good old virus of white arrogance. The courage to tell a black person that this is how I violated you, and therefore you're supposed to feel the pain this way. You're not supposed to feel the pain that way. This is how you're supposed to react and define the pain. Plus, you must prove to me beyond reasonable doubt that indeed you are feeling the pain. The hegemonic weight of racial knowledge and white liberalism over the public discourse in South Africa has normalized the use of insignificant words and phrases by black leaders and even some black academics, young and old, to analyze the problems of black people. One often hears words from the so-called liberation movement and previously conscious academics such as integration, rainbow nation, diversity, unity, multiracialism, Mandela, and the hilarious one, color blindness. These words, analysis, and concepts that are historically, financially, and geographically associated with European white liberal fundamentalism. These are the same ideas that define the curriculum content and institutional culture of the overwhelming majority of the South African universities, including this one, at the expense of terminating the value and presence of black and female students and the teachings of the communities they come from. Coming from a township barely 10 kilometers from this university, you will not find the perspectives, ideas, cultures, thinking, and history of your own people and the community you come from in the curriculum. From economics to architecture, from psychology to pharmacy, it is the same good old wine. Europeans and Americans know everything and your people know nothing. The poverty line in all textbooks is measured using a US dollar. The oceans that surround the African continent are named in English. They refer to all 195 countries as simply developed and developing countries instead of colonial powers and previously colonized countries. They do not mention that the 27% unemployment rate is a synonym of black poverty. They refer to the entrepreneurship that takes place in a community as an informal economy. Pages and pages of textbooks are littered with constant condescending viewpoints stating that a people is poor because they are lazy, a people is rich because they work hard. And the protest is not a constitutional tool to usher in change, but is an inconvenience that will weaken the rand. All these are glimpses of the humiliating experience of black students in the curriculum, all in the name of getting a qualification to certify white supremacy and black invincibility. Challenging these practices inside the classroom has academic consequences for black students. As you are all aware, for black students, academic consequences are also socio-economic consequences. In practice, this will entail, as Velimbele puts it, a situation whereby, as a black student, even when you have to think about challenging the lecturer, you first have to think about your position in the world. Racism has a way in which it consensus black students to discipline their thoughts so that when they finally verbalize them, they come out in a well-manicured, polite way, and they don't offend the inventors and primary beneficiaries of racism in the room. As a response, they produce a response, a type of a liberal discourse, which some refer to the politics of respectability. I'll make just a small example of how this took place practically. I was in a conference recently with one of my colleagues. She's black. We were at the University of Pretoria, and the discussion in this other lecture room was about inequality in South Africa. Of the plus minus 45 people in that lecture room, including the chair of the discussion, we were the only two who were not white, and we were seated at the back. I think there was another lady with dreadlocks at the front. So we were three. These white students there appeared as some kind of an intellectual elite, highly educated, bright, and for the most part, very, very liberal people. As the discussion unfolded in the room, it became increasingly clear that if the two of us, plus the person with dreadlocks, if the two of us don't mention the race question in this discussion about inequality, no one will mention it. These white students are not conscious enough of the fact that race, their race, was an integral aspect of every conversation they were having. When my colleague raised the issue in the dialogue, now this is my colleague, she raised her hand, and she mentioned the race question in the discussion. These white students felt accused of being racist. In this instance, they felt accused of being racist. So my observation was that in this instance, silencing took place when the planners were not clear that race was present at the conference, even if no people of color attended. The white participants didn't include the reality of others in their plan. And when the issue was raised by my colleague, she was made to feel as though she was the one who is causing trouble. Silencing my colleague therefore took place again when one of the white students stood up and defended his case on the issue we raised. He was basically saying that there is no need to use race to solve inequality. My fellow colleague did not reply to him, not because she agreed with the nonsense he was saying, but she kept quiet to avoid appearing as a person who's making the discussion and the entire conference difficult. In other words, the debate was subconsciously silenced, and they thought she agreed with their logic. That's the invincible social structural power of white privilege, the ability to silence debates quietly. The administrative apparatus of the university, now coming back home to, what's this? Nelson Mandela University, yeah. The administrative apparatus of the university also carries a systematic dogma of racial knowledge. Its duty is to maintain the institutional culture of the university and run its system in a predictable, rigid, certain, regular, and consistent manner. Anyone who tampers with this established, predictable, rigid, certain, regular, and consistent pattern is alienated and illegitimized. One cannot forget the embarrassing statement released at the beginning of the 2016 second semester by NMMU. Those at the top management distanced themselves and pointed at middle management based in the marketing department. Second semester, just for those who don't remember, 2016 second semester was held by a student and workers' protest, and the university released a statement saying, and I quote, "Staff and students are advised not to come to North and South campuses due to a protest." Let me repeat the statement they released. Staff and students are advised not to come to North and South campuses due to a protest. The NMMU statement was clearly attempting to criminalize the others who are not staff and students who are protesting. It is doing this by asking staff and students not to come to campus because of a protest, as if those conducting the protest are not students and staff. In sociology, we emphasize that a social movement, no matter how big or small it is, no matter if it is successful or not, there's a message that it is communicating which people must pay attention to. The people participating in the protest are not stupid. They are not causing inconvenience as some commentators would like to make us believe. Instead, people participating in a protest are intellectuals of note. A protest is a form of scholarship. People in a protest are thinking, and they are also in pain. They articulate their oppression and tactic towards their freedom. They're a group that is coming up with theory about their condition. If you take politics, history, and context into consideration, it was suffering and a social movement that produced giants of the liberation literature, and Steve Biko, Fanon, Malcolm X, Chris Hani, and Robert Sobukwe, but to name a few. Today, that theory that oppressors try to crush is being cited to produce PhD scholars and is a source of inspiration and political education to the youth. That can never ever be illegitimate. Traditionally, protests in South Africa, one could say, originated in the townships, where a racialized class dispute engulfed between a black working class against apartheid colonialism. Those protests didn't necessarily have formal rules and arrangements. It was purely masses of our people organizing themselves how they wanted and expressing the true extent of their tactics and emotions. Now, the protests were happening in the townships, right? Now, because these protests have now moved from townships to the upper class suburbs and universities, where the rich people reside, Suddenly now there is a caution, coordination, application and control of how the black working class must protest in an acceptable manner. Any black protest that does not appreciate the standards set by the rich suburb is deemed illegitimate by the decorum. Let me conclude. In conclusion, South Africa is still a racist apartheid society daily. Locally, it is the white race and the sprinkle of blacks with a double consciousness that drive to work. The rest still stay far away from their workplace and take 3 taxis daily to get to work using poverty wages. That is a daily experience of the racist apartheid society I am referring to. The biggest danger then in this whole violent phenomenon would be for black people to lose their agency and activism integrity. Racism has done damage in humiliating our people, but it just cannot be allowed to successfully make black people consistently receptive to their own suffering and pain. It also cannot be acceptable for black people to actively participate in the oppression and humiliation of other black people. As Veli puts it, it is only when black people have a proper understanding of the place of blackness in the collective unconscious of the world that they will begin to see that soporific constructs such as non-racialism, color blindness, reverse racism, hate speech, social cohesion, multiculturalism, rainbow nation, all those nice terms, they were not designed to end black suffering, but to obscure it, and at best, these constructs serve as an instrument of black anger management. Essentially, these are tools the system uses to police black thought and black resistance. Once black people begin to see this, they might also begin to see racism for what it is, really, an act of war against them. I say this because I do not want to appear polite and respecting to the decorum as a student and as a young person, because that results in the co-opting of the student voice and practices by the system. At all times, we must be vigilant and be able to collectively understand what Andre Lorde meant when she said, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." With those few words, Chairperson, I'm saying forward, get to the anti-racism movement forward. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks to a brilliant panel. Especially thank you for squeezing such rich and incisive contributions into such small time spaces. And the resonance between the papers were just wonderful. We have half an hour for discussion, and I'd like to ask colleagues, comrades, friends to be very concise with your questions, comments, and you take 4 at a time, and please introduce yourself, and if it's appropriate, say who you're directing your particular question, comment to. You can start. I've got 3 hands, and I'm sure we'll find another one.
Okay, thank you very much. The name is Jabulo Stemison Galose, BA History and Politics student. I'd like to thank Mr. Pedro Mzilimi for such profound knowledge that he has given. It's things that we always think about, but we're not sure, because particularly I'm a first-year student, we're not sure how to voice out such things. And I feel like in this country, particularly whenever we speak about such issues, Mandela's voice is used, his voice and his words are used to silence us. So my question to you, Mr. Pedro, is what amicable solution do you think will serve best for the social problems that we encounter in this country? Bearing in mind that our intention as black people is never to marginalize other races, but it's to identify ourselves and be recognizable as blacks in this country, just like everyone else, just like the minority races as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ntapula.
Sorry, Christy, I just have a question for you. Very interesting and everything, but how do you feel that in upping this racism game, it should affect you as a white woman? Because it has been shown that the biggest beneficiaries of transformation at certain points have been white women. How will you self-displace yourself? Then just a question maybe for both Pedro and Dr. Mbofu. One for Dr. Mbofu first. Why assume that when I mention isiXhosa, I'm Xhosa myself and therefore essentializing? No, but why assume that I'm not talking as Mbuki will talk? Why assume that the mention by a black person of their language will lead into the danger of essentialism? Why not assume that when a black person says something about the language, they are speaking as Mbuki would speak? Why constantly caution against that when Africans already know what they mean? Pedro and Nolukolo, how are we going to institutionalize something if it's not in a performance agreement? Perhaps the issue is what are the criteria by which we will demonstrate, Pedro, all the things that you are saying, that they have to be ticked off on a box, but that we have to find the right criteria to tick off the box.
Thanks, Nomalanga. I think now I've forgotten where that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody on the panel. Really interesting. I think that, and this also speaks to Nomalanga's presentation, that we are not engaging in conceptual clarity here. So there's a proxy. Race is being used as a proxy for a few things. One is class. And so I'm constantly hearing the shift between race and class with apparently no distinction and no awareness, or rather no articulation of the connections between them. This is an old debate, and I'm not going to bring up new things, but the point is that within our class system, race has a particular function, and we're so deciding where the boundaries of race is, yet can we discuss what the function of race and race thinking and racism is and does? And in the spirit of an attempt to decolonize, perhaps we can talk about multiple racisms, because then how in fact we talk about xenophobia? How in fact we talk about these things in the absence of class formations and in the shifting demographics that we have and in the global dislocations we have. So I'm really, really thankful, especially to the BIT speaker, because I really do feel as though when we talk about essentializing race, we might well mean the pure understanding of blackness, for example, but we live in a context where that's not hegemonic. What's hegemonic is apartheid categories of race, and it is legitimated by the state, it's legitimated by those in power, and we are those in power. We keep legitimating these things. We're maintaining them, we're recreating them. So any discussion around how much pain this is causing us is completely undermined by the fact that we keep perpetuating what we say we want to do away with.
Thank you. We had a fourth, I've got no visual memory, so there was a fourth. Well, yeah, we'll come back to you though. I think you were before. Or you, there was somebody in the first round? Yeah. Okay, we have three more questions, but I'm going to stop after this one and then we do a next round. Is it okay to wait? Yeah. Okay, last one for this round.
My name is Kaman Sinefu. I'm a student of Nelson Mandela University. I first want to allude to the fallacy of the four-race theory as something that was legitimized by scientists based on Darwin to further the economic agenda after the implosion of Europe based on the competition of national resources and space. And therefore it must be understood that's where racism in its current modernist posture must be understood to advance economic interests of a particular group over the other. Number two, I want to bring and put it to the panel that racism is a disease. Strenuously, if we're going to talk about it as something that is only a social thing and not a medical phenomenon, we are going to miss the point. It is a disease that is perpetuated by those who want to elevate themselves, of course, using the complexities of either inferior or superior complex over one another, but to gain something. They also, those who are superior in the result, are sufferers of their own actions. Now, quick question to the SRC president. What is your view, leadership, on the history syllabus of our country since 1994? Because there is a date that all of us here in this room know. It's 1652. But there is a date that all of us are not told about. 1902. The Anglo-Boer War. It's brushed off. They do not tell us what happened when white against white people fought against each other for economic scramble after the Rand and the discovery of diamond. And number two, what are the repercussions if we are going to overlook 1910, 1913, 1948, and the period of negotiation started in 1990 up until 94? And what then will it impact on us not understanding or having a discourse honestly and enable us to move forward if we do not touch on those dates but only look at the fourth record, the arrival of the dust East Indian Company? I forgot about that. I don't take it serious. So I want to Commander to look into that. And lastly, to the rest of the panel, ours is a different type of colonialism. We term it the colonization of a special type because there's an intersection of the triple oppression of our people, which is based on class, based on race, and also based on gender. Now, leadership, I want you to try, if you time allows, to make us understand, is there a hierarchy that we must start with race or we must start with class? Is there no way, theoretically, how we can address all these three contradictions in the case of South Africa at the same time? And lastly, what is the progress with the punishability of racism and encoding it as or legislating it so that when a person has racist behavior and tendencies, they are punishable? Because I will say it here, in this university, there is no president, I'm doing research on it. There is no one here who has been punished on any racist behavior. They are suspended for 6 months, and after 6 months, they come back, and they are suspended again. They are never dealt with accordingly. Those are my inputs and questions. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I think the panel's got quite a challenge, but we should hand over to you to answer whichever feels appropriate, and perhaps we'll start and move across.
Can I start?
I'll start with Emily.
Yeah, regarding the question of essentializing, because I think it's going to come up. Oh, okay. I am a technophobe, and it shows. The question of essentializing, I think, is going to continue if it is not addressed at the very beginning. My understanding of the term essentializing race would, by that I understand, is meant that I believe that because of my skin, I am similar to Pedro sitting next to me, solely on the basis of my skin, right? We are black, and therefore black people do this. We are black, and therefore black people have this culture, etc., etc. That does not mean that black people experience the world in particular ways because of the way they're positioned in the world. Do you understand? I differentiate between essentializing as a biological, for example, quality that we would both have because of the color of our skins. However, the fact that we both are black are positioned in a racist way in the same way. That's the distinction I make. Okay. And then the relationship between race and class, I do not even think that we need to, this is intersectionality, there's a lot that has been written about this, and particularly in South Africa, the issue of what comes first, race and class, is a question that has been asked in the liberation movements, etc., etc. But one thing that we cannot run away from is that class has a face of race. Poverty in South Africa is black. Okay. Racism as a disease, actually I do agree with you, and I think one of the questions that I raised pertain to precisely that. It is a psychological disease. We are addicted to it. Some of us are addicted to it. Some of us get pleasure, psychological pleasure from it, on top of the material benefits that we get from it. And then scientific racism, I'm not sure I understood your question, but scientific racism arose at the end of slavery, when science was brought in to justify what had earlier been justified on the basis of culture and civilization. Some people are more civilized than others. Some people are Christians, therefore they have the right to colonize others, etc. At the end of slavery, when there was more need to justify the continuation of racism, scientific racism was brought in. And then progress, I'm glad I don't have to answer that, because you are speaking about Mandela University in terms of the progress that has been made in punishing people who are racist.
Okay, quickly, I think the question directed to me came prominently from Prof. I did not assume that you are closer. You are assuming that I assume. My intervention was based on the context. That when we were discussing, you said, let us have this decolonial debate in Xhosa.
That was just an example of what I said in the event.
That is the context. Hear me out.
Why not assume I'm saying the same thing that Ngugi said? That's all I'm asking.
Okay, and when Ngugi said that, he was called out himself.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Why? Not because his interlocutors were opposed to indigenous languages. Ngugi was called out mainly by Achebe, that we were having a continental debate in Makerere, and you are taking the debate into your mother tongue, not only isolating the white people that were fighting, but isolating other speakers of other African languages. So that, let me finish. Right. So when you are saying then let's do it in Xhosa, to me you were doing the underside of Ngugi's argument. Of course it had its upper side, because part of decolonizing and part of the decolonial philosophy is the construction and systemic building of indigenous languages into languages of science. And our governments are lacking the political will and the social wisdom to see the importance of that. And if you can, in a decolonial attitude, learn from the colonizer, not learn to be a colonizer. Afrikaans was first written down, I think in 1913. In 1918, it was at primary school and university. And then 1925, it was in parliament. 1933, there was the Afrikaans Bible. As I speak, there are engineers, medical doctors, and other professions and even intellectuals that practice their science only in Afrikaans. They had the political will and the gravitas to build their language from a dialect to a language of science. The black government in South Africa and elsewhere in the global south has no excuse not to do that with our languages. But we must be careful about using our mother tongues and mother cultures as forms of nativism. Ngugi was warned about that. And recently in 2013, he himself warned himself and said the language of the world, the language of the human is translation. And Prof, while we speak about critical humanism, there are these ideas that have been forwarded by people like my Professor Jimmy Attention about endogeneity, indigeneity. They are very important ideas at decolonization. But if we don't handle them critically, we sink into the same problems that we seek to avoid. Let me give you an example, a telling example. If we say right now, let's retreat to Ubuntu, there's no one innocent thing out there that is called Ubuntu. Because when Desmond Tutu said to Ubuntu, Umuntu ngabanye abantu, it was not just Ubuntu speaking, but also a Christian, which could decline the approach into turning the other cheek, forgiving seculars without justice, reconciliation without justice and reparations. So even our indigenous sensibilities, some of them have been subsumed and injected with the colonial idea. Any racist now can say, practice Ubuntu, just to say remain disciplined. But the whole body of Ubuntu is not about forgiveness, as it was narrowed in the TRC. Ubuntu can be about a good fight. Yeah, so that's why we say let's approach these things critically, because not even our mother tongues are innocent anymore. People practice sexism, practice racism, practice hate, practice xenophobia using mother tongues. Our mother tongues have not escaped coloniality. That is the contribution of decoloniality, to unmask hidden contours and currents of power and toxic agendas of empire that are now buried in our proverbs and in our daily sensibilities. Yeah. So what I'm asking for is just that critical consciousness, not to say we must forget about ourselves and where we come from. I think I've answered the question that was directed to me.
Thanks, Dr. Paul. The other two speakers who would like to respond, and we're hoping to have another quick round and then go to the last session. Christy.
Thanks. In terms of class in relation to race, of course, I think it is very important to not summarily conflate those categories. But as you know, there is a very close coincidence in South Africa between class and race. And that's something that remains entrenched. Actually, if we look also at the latest Stats SA figures, placing the vast majority of poor people as being black. I don't know who exactly you thought on the panel was conflating class and race. But I mean, conceptually, yes, it's important to distinguish. At the same time, I think it's very important to acknowledge the very close coincidence of the two and the overlapping nature in those two categories. I don't know if do you want to add something?
Yeah.
To clarify my point, it was linked to the point of essentializing. I mean, no, essentializing is not the idea that I'm black and you're black and white. That's homogenizing. Essentializing in the sense that the fact that I'm poor is the black, the melanin in my skin is the reason I'm, not the reason I'm poor, because that was historically the reason I'm poor, but that I'm inherently poverty-stricken because of my blackness. I think, and there's a fine line here, because of course we know that this is not true, because there are people who are black who are not poor. I mean, so this idea that essentialist notions of anything can be linked to the color of our skin, because we're talking about phenotype here. When we talk about race, we're talking about phenotypical characteristics, and nobody has gone forward a way beyond that. So I'm trying to, what my point basically was that if we essentialize race in the way that we have always done, in the way that says that, I'm going to say, if we're black, it means we are stupid. If we're black, it means we are poor. These things are not a given. These things are socially created as races. And until we can start to separate these things, we are going to remain with this problem. And this is why I talk of multiple racisms. Because if we stay with the black-white depiction of racism, we ignore a whole range of other racisms that can't be so easily contracted to black and white.
And I would agree with you that it's important then to take that apart, because I have to say my own research also shows that in white discourses, there's a convenient conflation of poverty with blackness in order to, in fact, justify poverty. You know, sort of as poverty, kind of a notion. I'm talking about now everyday discourses. Kind of a notion of poverty as sort of inherent or to blackness. You know, so yes, I would agree with taking that apart. Then Nomlanga, of course, I mean, I thought you said you were very willing to engage with white academics, and they don't necessarily have to all go. But you know, I don't know. I'm sort of thinking that your question sounds to me like it's sort of arising from a bit of a homogenization of whiteness. And I must say that as you were sort of insisting on not homogenizing blackness, I would also insist on not doing that with whiteness, you know. So and that's where the intersectionality question comes in for me. Can I just? Yeah. So the question for me is that that ultimately we have to bring in gender, sexuality, class, and other markers to fully grasp subject positions, you know. And I'm not going to belabor my own class status that I might have had at some point, or the fact that I'm a lesbian, or anything like that. But what I will insist on is the fact that I have spent not even only my adult life, but even my young, my teenage life, I've actually spent in writing and struggling in my way against racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, and all the other various oppressions and discriminations that I grew up with as somebody who was born in the apartheid era and beyond. So, and I will continue doing that wherever I might be placed.
Just asking if I should take your job, that's all.
Can we let Pedro respond? We want to do a quick another round because I really feel bad about the people who've been waiting.
Okay, thank you, Chair. For me, there were two questions. I want to address the lady, what's her name? Nadima. Okay. Nadima, you see, with the race, let me explain from how I understand it. In the context that we're in South Africa. So, white lunatics came to this continent, and the lunatics, they took the land. They took the land using, firstly, their primary weapon was a gun. Right? Remember, with a gun, you have power. You can tell whoever what to do. Even an 8-year-old that can walk into this room carrying a gun, that 8-year-old has power to tell all of us what to do. So, lunatics came in, they were driven by greed. Greed drove them, because when I was that side, I was so shocked that, man, Portugal, Spain, Belgium are all at a driving distance. They are small countries. How did they take over such big countries in the continent and in Latin America? They are such small countries. Anyways, so lunatics came, they pointed the gun, they took the land. Now the land was your source of living as a black person. Not only did they take the land, but they proletarized you. What's the word? They proletarize you as a black person. Now that gave them the power to establish the hierarchy of bodies in society by placing a white man at the top of the value chain as a body that is important, right? And a black woman at the bottom as a person who is not important. Now that hierarchy of bodies and how they are valued has never stopped since that time and up until even today. That is why you will find even a rich black person globally is not valued, because the black body was deemed to have no value whatsoever by that colonial system. An example of Oprah. Oprah goes to buy a handbag. She's told by a mere white receptionist that she's nothing, she can't afford this. Why? Because even though she has class power, the money that we're talking about, but the color of her skin, her black body, is deemed to be of no value whatsoever global. The pattern goes on. Usain Bolt, Caster Semenya, all those people, Serena Williams, they all suffer from the same thing, that their bodies, when you have that dark skin, you are undervalued. The same thing even with the white body. I always listen to some white kind people, Shem. They like to say, no, but I'm a nice person, I'm not racist. Fine. If two professors walk into a room, this was said earlier on by Prof. Mandela, if two professors walk into a room, a white professor and a black professor, the room will automatically assume that the person who is intelligent between these two is a white person, without even him speaking, because her body, the skin color on itself, without doing anything, but the presence of that skin color gives you advantages over other people because of that legacy of colonialism. So that's how I understand the concept of race from where I'm seated. It's not about whether you're a nice person or you smile. It's your body, the features of your body that have devalued other people. Number two, the last one that was referred to me, colonialism of a special type. Can't we address all three at the same time? Again, if you come to the context of South Africa, there's no way you can separate race on the left and class and say, okay, we're going to start with this one, followed by this one. No, they hit you, all of them at the same time. My previous lecturer at ARNHE used to make an example about standing at a four-way stop. You're standing in the middle of a four-way stop, right? And four cars are coming at you, all from all four corners at the same time, and they smash you at the same time. When you are injured, which car are you going to say hit you the most out of the four? You can't determine it because the violence is dealing with you intersectionally all at the same time. So the literature of the organization that you are coming from, the one that is always quoting Marx, it's now being put into scrutiny because Marxism has limitations if you come to the South African context, which is what I believe we're beginning to do in that organization now. I heard last year people quoting Oyewumi, who dismisses the concept of how gender has been articulated in that organization, because she begins by saying that in the first instance, how we understand gender has always been from a woman who comes from a nucleus family, which is European and American. But however, the concept of gender and a woman in the African context is completely different from what is the mainstream outlook. So that's how I would like to answer those two questions. And then for yours, I'll come back in the second round.
Thanks, Associate President. I know you. We really appreciate the response. And we did start the session a little bit late, so we're going to take another couple of minutes to conclude it. And the three people who've been waiting really patiently, so they are there and there and there, and I'm afraid that's it. I know my colleague over there also had, is it a comic? Can it be quite quick at the end? No, yeah, because I know you had your hand up at an earlier point. So we start over there, we'll go to Bev and then here and then back to you. And then, but can we really reiterate to be as quick as possible and you directly introduce yourself as well.
Hi, my name is Risi Wenzile. I'm a politics and public administration student. I'll try to be as brief as possible, but there's just so much that was said, so I'll try to just clump everything together. With these race dialogues, there's an expectation that you can actually going to attack it vigorously and be as honest as possible with regards to the root of racism in essence. But I feel sometimes we like to romanticize the notion of racism and like to attack it from a theoretical perspective without necessarily attacking anyone and protecting certain privileges and classes within the discussion itself. There's a lack of honesty with regards to these particular discussions that I feel sometimes occurs. I think you attack racism from a diplomatic point of view, in which in its nature it's not. When you feel it, it's very oppressive and it's very direct to you. So I think within these discussions that needs to happen, there must be a certain honesty and frankness, even from a lectural and academic perspective. Because the presentation you give is a direct reflection of the ability of students' ability to give their views within a class setting as well. So it sets precedence as well that how you attack and view certain things is how we're going to do it within the classroom setting. So the diplomacy that Pedro speaks about within the classroom setup and the viewing is often from a point of your ability. Your viewing and your opinion is often certified by your ability to regurgitate information from the textbook and slides. And doesn't allow for the flexibility of opinion, which can be from various backgrounds and environments. And I'd just like to note that when you speak on the decoloniality of the university setup and the infrastructure itself, you must understand that education came from a colonial rule which was used to oppress certain people and certain classes, and as a result, certain races. So now the information, the knowledge production has got an ownership value which has a face. And now when we speak of the commodification thereof, it's often, as you stated correctly, it's got a market value. It's got a market placing as well. So in essence, it's how best to maintain the system in itself. Okay, so I think that's just what I want to say. I've been signaled the time as well, but I just want my question was, by virtue of receiving this education, you are almost leaving your working class, and you're almost entering a space of petty bourgeoisie, by virtue of just you getting an education, because how I'll be viewed in a township will be different now. It's almost as I'm the person who has the know-how. So now how then do you find the equilibrium point of representing the views of a liberation movement while still entering almost a capitalistic system that exploits a certain face and a certain class? So that's just what I wanted to know.
Thanks very much. Beverly Favor, I'm at UWC. I might just also mention that I am a member of the Council on Higher Education as a ministerial appointee, but I'm talking in my personal capacity. I want to just add a note of enigma to the question of race and to put paid to the myth of race being a phenotype only. For the past few years, well, it's all come, just recently, last week, I was in a dialogue and I had incredible hostility towards me. And when I asked, as we started talking, it was mentioned that, well, you're a white person. And when I said, well, I'm afraid to tell you that I'm not, the entire fiber of that conversation shifted. And I was acceptable. And that has been happening in a very, very concentrated form recently. So I think that and my background from the 70s has been training in black consciousness. So when I got into university in 2000, when we tried to put the issue of race onto the agenda in universities, there was absolutely no space to put it onto the agenda because the funding system discriminated against the phenomena of race. And it triggered, earlier on, the thought triggered that the Marxist framework was essentially class, and probably that was one of the reasons why the issue of race was not seen as an area of study. Okay. So the point I'm trying to drive home is that the complexity of universities is really under-researched, and that we haven't begun to see the networks of power and reproduction of race, which Peter is pointing to, as a very, very deeply embedded and structural phenomenon that the students have woken us up about. And I think that that really is, you know, an area that we can begin to move in that direction, but it's a complex area. And I think that the elephant in the room is really not being addressed.
What is the elephant in the room?
It's not a question, it's more like a comment. I'm glad, Pofu, you actually said at the end that there's the scientific nature of, you talk about the scientific nature of local languages. Because it's always concerning whenever we talk about indigenous languages, people then speak about ethnic problems, especially in South Africa. So I'm really happy that you address that part, because we want to leave here thinking that whenever we talk about the local languages as as knowledge, as sources of knowledge, because in South Africa we haven't developed to a point whereby our local languages, we can just put them aside and start talking about, you know, other forms of our English, especially. I think it's very premature to actually advocate for a post-race kind of, we're all human in South Africa. We are not, I don't think we are there yet in South Africa, where we can all be human. And also we need to be honest about the fact that the racialized categories in this country are still very much in place, and also they still determine people's life chances. How the apartheid set up the categories, the different categories, they are still possessing a lot of power, a lot of opportunities, a lot of differentiation amongst racialized groups. So I don't think we are at a point whereby we can start talking about all of us are human and let's talk post-race. I think that is really unfair.
Thank you. Very final, very quick.
Okay, this is going to be very quick. Firstly, I don't want to underplay the whole issue of racism in this country. It's one of the most painful things that has actually happened to many people in this country, and therefore cannot be really underplayed. But one of the most painful things for me is to be dehumanized and silenced because of the race I belong to, or the language that I speak, the Mpofu, or the Germanies, the violence and the marginalization that we actually get into Mr. Stafford. But it's not only the white leadership at universities that actually do that, but also those people who are not really white. And maybe because they've been assimilated into the Eurocentric thinking, the Eurocentric violence, and the domination and competition. One of the most painful things is to be oppressed by your own people. Race at university is actually sometimes camouflaged so that it is not really evident. And therefore, oppression goes on. Men's inhumanity to men, women's humanity to women, blacks' humanity to blacks. The scramble for higher positions in universities is not only racism, but also it has something to do with greed, Pedro, you mentioned that, corruption and nepotism. Professor van der Westhuizen, what are the possibilities? Thank you.
Thanks. Colleagues, I want to apologize to those people who had their hands up and hadn't had a chance. There will be time to continue the dialogue. It's really just beginning and it can happen now. Also, apology to Alan, who's getting very irate. He keeps excellent time. And we have gone over time quite considerably. Big apologies. If you may, can we just give the panel a few minutes to very quickly respond, and then we'll conclude this panel.
Okay, thank you. I'll be quick. Like what my colleague here said, racism has got toxic categories of its own. And one of the most violent forms of racism in the westernized university, like any other, is epistemic racism, which expels non-European people from the universe of thinking, whereby it is assumed from outside that you do not think. And this is attached to a toxic myth that circulates around here, the myth of this thing called quality. That when certain languages, when certain bodies come into the university, then quality will go down. as if there was a paradise one day in the university where something called quality was a citizen. That word has assumed certain value judgments that are racist and colonial. That's why I describe it as epistemic racism. And you must be careful about it. We would rather talk about rigor rather than quality. Because to decolonize is also not to advocate for refusal to do hard work. Yeah. We have never said that. Right, and then it would be unfortunate if we conclude this meeting without describing fees must fall as anti-racism. Colleagues, I would like to refer you to a researcher online called Robert Kricker, with a small little paper called Shredding the Veil of Reconciliation. He might not be recognized as a seminal leading scholar, and the reasons are that of epistemic racism. He explains how these particular universities that we're existing in were created foundationally for the sons of empire. The landlords in this country were mobilized by Cecil John Rhodes and other empire builders to fund the education of the sons of empire. Landlords still exist. They mine platinum, they farm the land, they make billions of rent and US dollars in this country. Why are they not being mobilized by black liberation politicians to fund the descendants of the slaves that are in the university now? So fees must fall is connected to the struggle of decoloniality and anti-racism. And if we don't see it like that, we'll be reneging on an important part of the struggle. Thank you very much.
Any comments? You don't have.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Chair. The last comment I want to make is from a question from my leader there. The solutions now for us young black students. I think firstly, leader, we're in the right direction because if you remember, other colleagues will also remember. This university, if you compare it from between 2014 and today, it's very different. Even how those ones who are at senior management, how they speak to you now, it's very different how they speak to you. So the point I'm trying to make is the protests we led in 2015 and 2016 did shake the lion in the cage, and the concessions that we've scored this year are boxes to tick, but we must now intensify our mission. It's our own generational mission, and I believe that we want to achieve it, which is free education for Bantu Makoti. And the last point I want to make is that whilst we are in these university spaces, let us not forget what we are known for, which is to be highly, highly excellent in the academic project that we have, because the generation before us, the stories of them being in university are out there. So we must honor our responsibility that even though the system has now been opened up for our people to access it, let us now go in there and excel in that system and produce the knowledge that is being marginalized by current patterns of racism. So that is what I have personally committed to. When I came into the system, I came in with a different career in mind. When I was at the receiving end of the epistemic violence, I decided that no. I think that there's something wrong with what is being taught, and I think I could contribute as an academic in revealing to our people their knowledge that is hidden in the curriculum. So master your books, leader. Excel in everything that you do. Prof. Nomalanga says the due date is the 20th of June. Submit on the 20th of June.
That's a great message. It's very important. Yeah. If you have
My conclusion will be a question, because my curiosity has been aroused. What is the elephant in the room, Beverly? And can we not discuss it? Can we not actually address whatever elephant there is in the room? Sorry? No, this is an invitation from both of us to you, Beverly, to draw us into.
Thank you very much for the question, and I think we are going to leave it to filter into the room, and we'll continue no doubt in our dialogues, we hope. And I think we need to give the panel another big round of applause for it.
Can I just say a final line? Yes. Just to say thank you very much for that question. In a nutshell, I mean, I think what I was trying to drive at this with my input was that, to state very briefly, we need to recapture our universities as critical intellectual spaces. And for me, that would be done by tackling neoliberalization, in its racial, gender, class, and sexual dimensions as they're playing out across our universities. And then, Nomalanga, if you want my job, please go for it. I mean, I'm frequently feeling I would rather actually give it up. Yeah.
I think one last comment.
This is the very last comment. I raised that issue of leadership earlier. This is in response to your comments. And I think it is imperative that if we're going to speak about transformation in the higher education sector, that we really question and look into who goes up the ladder into those offices of leadership in this sector.
Once again,
can we give him another hand?
It's a network.
And I'm going to ask JC to come and do the vote of thanks. He serves on the exco of the ARNHE, and they've been hosting in the Free State the sort of admin hosts of the structure, and we still have some work to do. So we're not done yet today. This part of the work is done, but we are going to be having another meeting after this for a while. Just want to say also that please do go out and buy the book. Jake is a co-author of Legitimation and Transformation in Post-Apartheid Universities, looking at the case of race. And I want to say that also that please use the opportunity. See, people are actually leaving now, but we are hoping that you're going to network. There are people sitting in this room, and they are all engaged in their own ways with trying to work into the intersectionalities that we are speaking about. So please look around you and make contact with other people at the other varsities. And then lastly, there's a copy of the last colloquium on sale outside for 50 Rand. I think there are a few more copies left over. So JC, over to you.
Thanks, Alan. Let me start by thanking all of you as participants and part of the audience, because I mean it's the people who come to the colloquium that makes the colloquium, that brings the energy and engagement and everything. So thank you very much each one of you for coming. I can't make any closing remarks because I think it's not closing anything. My head is kind of spinning in terms of the richness of the debate and questions that was raised, remarks. So I think we all can have some time to reflect on all that was shared today. And I want to thank especially all the speakers today for the effort they put into their presentations, but also the way in which they presented and stimulated the debate. And then lastly, I want to thank CANRAD under the leadership of Alan and with his whole team. They have been one of the driving forces behind the anti-racism network in higher education. Very supportive, not just financially, but beyond that, also in administratively hosting it for some years, and then specifically for organizing this colloquium this morning. And I think we can all give them a round of applause.
And congratulations, they said that you normally plan that everything works out. I understand that the food is on its way after all the rushing, but we of course do have another meeting to go to. So, but please, I hope that by the time we walk out, there is some food out there. Thank you.